So here's a dual process theory of ethical judgment. It's not exactly the theory that Green and others have in mind, nor is it exactly what you'll find in Kahneman or other of the key researchers. What I've done is taken some ideas and just stripped them right down to the core. Now, before we start, I'd like you, if you would please, to answer a dilemma. You should see it in the notes right below this video, but if that's not the case, you're going to have to go to this awkwardly long link in order to find it, or perhaps you can Google it. I'm sorry about that. It would just be very helpful if you answer the dilemma. Essentially, you're taken hostage by some terrorists and you have to decide whether or not to kill somebody in order to save more lives. So kind of thing you've been doing a lot on this course. I mean, answering dilemmas. Excellent. All right, what's a dual process theory? Well, I'm going to give you a picture. Let's start with these variables. So response one is a variable which specifies whether or not a response occurs, and if so, what the response is. So for example, if you just answered the dilemma and you said yes, response one would have the value yes, and otherwise it might have the value no. You see how that works? So that's just a variable that represents a particular response that you gave. Here's another variable, process one. This represents a particular process, whether or not that process occurs, and if so, what its outcome is. And the arrow linking the two is supposed to say that the probability of getting a value in response one depends to some interesting degree on what the value of process one is. You see how that works? So the value of this variable is probabilistically related to the value of that variable. Very good. Very simple. Right. Now we go on here, and these other variables are supposed to represent contextual factors like the instructions that you were given. So if I had given you different instructions, if I changed the dilemma, for example, that may well have changed the outcome of the process, which might in turn have changed the response, and so on, right? So I could have changed the instructions, the nature of the dilemma, the time pressure that you were under. I could have imposed cognitive load by making you go backwards and so on. Very good. So these variables here stand for different contextual factors. And you'll notice that I've got thin arrows and thick arrows. Now this is not a formal device. What I'm doing is using thick arrows and thin arrows just to suggest to you informally that some of these variables might have a strong effect on the process and others might have a less strong effect on the process. So if we imagine that, for example, here I'm suggesting that instructions don't have much of an effect on the process. So that would imply that the process is to some interesting degree automatic in just that sense. Your current task and desires don't make a lot of difference to whether or not the process occurs. Now, what's a dual process theory? Well, a dual process theory is just a theory in which there's a model of the responses according to which the responses are consequences of more than one process. So here you see I've got in my model now two processes, and these processes are differently affected by the contextual factors, and they have different strengths of effect on the response. What does it mean to say that these processes are distinct? Well, I guess we just take that for granted, but what we can say is that where they're meaningfully distinct, they should be sensitive to the contextual factors in different ways, and they should be able to make potentially dissociable contributions to response one. So there might be cases in which the two processes pull in opposite directions and one of them dominates. Now there's a feature of this model which is not very good, so I should draw your attention to it. The model here has a kind of static weight between response one and process one. So as you can see it here, the idea is that process one has a stronger effect on this response than process two. Now that's a simplification, not just because there might be other responses, for example a non-verbal, very fast and spontaneous response, perhaps some pattern of brain activity, where process two might have a stronger response than process one. The other complication here is this, that which process dominates the response and to what degree a process dominates a response may itself depend on the contextual factors. So the relations between processes and responses can change depending on the contextual factors, and that can actually be an interesting way to find evidence for the dual process theory. We'll come to that later when we consider process dissociation. But for now, I want to draw your attention to the idea that dual process theory is something incredibly simple. All it says is that any response will be a consequence of the operations of more than one process, and which outcomes those processes generate, whether they occur at all, will depend on a variety of contextual factors, but the contextual factors will have different effects on the different processes. Steve, it's so simple. It's so simple. What are we saying then? There are two or more ethical processes which are distinct in this sense. The conditions which influence whether or not they occur and which outputs they generate do not completely overlap. Tiny bit more, tiny bit, yep. One process makes fewer demands on scarce cognitive resources than the other. We're also going to add in this tiny assumption. So that means that the process, if it makes fewer demands on scarce cognitive resources, then increasing cognitive load by asking you to remember a 4-digit number or a 5-digit number or to count backwards, that will have less effect on this process than the other one. And we can mark that by using Kahneman's terminology, or terminology that he popularized. We can talk about a fast process, which is one that makes fewer demands on scarce cognitive resources, and a slower process, one that makes more. Now, what I stressed at the start is that this way of thinking about dual process theory is kind of extremely lightweight. I've stripped everything down. If you read Kahneman, for example, he will tell you things like, the fast process is typically unconscious, whereas the slow process often involves a conscious deliberation. Now, I don't want to say those things because I don't think that we need them in order to generate predictions. I think they involve unnecessary commitments as far as the theory goes. And I also think that what our dual process theory ought to do is to make the minimum demands necessary to generate predictions and leave further matters, like how and if at all consciousness might be involved here, as a matter for discovery. So we don't want to build that into the theory at the beginning. We want to be open to interesting discoveries on that topic. That anyway is the idea. So what we can do is take this as our minimal core. The dual process theory is our minimal core. It's rich enough just as it stands to generate some predictions, and as things go we can add assumptions to it and test the additional predictions we get, accepting the predictions if the assumption is confirmed. So I like this approach to dual process theories because it's very stripped down and it should be very simple. All right, you're with me so far. We've got the idea of a dual process theory of ethical abilities. Now, things are actually even simpler than I'm making out, because in the ethical domain, unlike other domains where dual process theories have been important, for example, object cognition, numerical cognition, mind reading, we're actually mainly considering just a single response. So nearly all of the research involves a verbal response to a dilemma. I think that's a shame, because I think we get great insight into dual process theories when we measure multiple different responses. But that's not the case here, so generally we've only got a single response. Things are simple. The other thing I want to say here is that the dual process theory, in and of itself, makes absolutely no commitments concerning neurophysiology, the geography of the brain. So it's not saying that the distinction between the two processes is going to correspond to a distinction between areas of the brain or different neural circuits even. Kahneman puts this very well, I think. He says that this is a distinction about software and not about hardware. What we're trying to capture with the dual process theory is largely what Ma would call the computational description, and maybe algorithms and representations, but not the hardware level of the mind. All right, brilliant. So let's go and try and generate a prediction. We've got a dual process theory, so we understand what it would be for a dual process theory in the ethical domain to be true. But it's not the kind of thing that we ought to accept because we feel, seems good or seems bad, we should reject it. We need to test its predictions. And to do that, what we're going to do is to vary different contextual factors. So, for example, consider what happens if we vary cognitive load. What sort of prediction might we arrive at? Well, the essence of the dual process theory says that if we're thinking about responses dominated by different processes, we should be able to find a situation where a response is highly sensitive to an increasing cognitive load, and a case where a response is much less sensitive to an increasing cognitive load. Now, the opponents of dual process theory sometimes put this incorrectly by saying that on the dual process theory, one of the processes, and therefore one of the responses, is supposed to be just entirely insensitive to cognitive load, as if it was magic, right? But probably nothing is insensitive to cognitive load, or almost nothing is insensitive to cognitive load. So that's just a pejorative way of categorizing the theory. What we're saying as proponents of the dual process theory is that cognitive load will have a differential effect. It will more strongly affect response dominated by one process than a response dominated by another process. How can we test that? Well, in order to use existing evidence, we're going to have to make an additional assumption. We're going to have to say that the slow process is responsible for characteristically consequentialist responses and the fast for other responses. This is not part of the dual process theory as such, so even if this additional assumption is false, it doesn't show that my dual process theory is false. But we're going to need this in order to generate the prediction which has been tested. What do I mean by characteristically consequentialist? Brilliant. What I mean by characteristically consequentialist is what green means. This term is from green. It means a response which is the kind of response that would typically be generated by a consequentialist theory. So we're not making a particular claim about the theory that the person has. We're just saying that the response is in line with what a consequentialist theory would demand. That's what we mean by characteristically consequentialist. It's in the glossary in the notes, actually. All right, very good. So how do we get a prediction? Well, the idea is this. If we increase cognitive load, that ought to slow down the slow process more than it slows down the fast process. That's the way we characterize them. If the slow process is responsible for the characteristically consequentialist responses, then in that case, people who are giving characteristically consequentialist responses ought to slow down more when we increase cognitive load than people who are not giving characteristically consequentialist responses. So think back to the dilemma that I asked you to think about earlier. You're captured by terrorists, and roughly speaking, you have to kill one person in order to save 5. If you decide to do that, then you've given a characteristically consequentialist response. You've achieved a good outcome, but you've done something which is really terrible. You killed somebody. So what we're predicting is that when you give that answer, yes, I will kill one person to save 5, you're giving a characteristically consequentialist response. That's driven by the slow processes. The slow processes will be slowed down more by cognitive load, and therefore you'll be slower to respond. Here's what Green and colleagues found. With no cognitive load, the responses were given in just about 5.5 seconds. Just about 5.5 seconds. That's actually pretty quick to decide such a weighty matter. What happens when they increased cognitive load here? You can see that they call them utilitarian in this case, but they mean characteristically consequentialist judgments slowed down significantly, and there was no effect, pleasingly, or no measurable effect on the non-characteristically consequentialist judgments. Very good. So this is actually a lovely prediction of the dual process theory, which seems to support the dual process theory together with that additional assumption. All right, so that was cognitive load. Let's take a look at another factor. Can we think about a prediction that might follow from manipulating time pressure? What sort of predictions might we make here? Same additional assumption as before. The slow process is responsible for the characteristically consequentialist responses. Prediction: if we limit the time available to make a decision, we're going to reduce characteristically consequentialist responses. Why does that prediction follow? Well, the slow process is one we're assuming that depends more on scarce cognitive resources. So if you're time limited, you can make less use of those scarce cognitive resources. So your slow process ought to be less good. It ought to be that it will complete less often, and then it will produce the correct answer less often, or the answer that it's supposed to produce anyway. It won't produce the answer that it's supposed to produce under time pressure. Its accuracy relative to its aim will drop. So that being the case, what we'd expect is that there will be fewer consequentialist responses, either because the slow process, which is responsible for them, isn't completing at all, so isn't getting a chance to influence the response, or because it's going astray, right? It's having to give an early answer and it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's not giving the answer that it's supposed to give you. So let's see what happens. This is an experiment by Tremollet and Bonifant, and it's worth thinking about this because we're going to come back to this in a later lecture. So Tremollet and Bonifant found that when people are killing 1 to save 5, and they are time free, they tend to do that significantly more often than when they're time limited. They tend to do that significantly more often. So what they're saying is, look, when we limit time, make people decide faster, they tend to be much less likely to give the characteristically consequentialist response here. Very good. They also imagine what happens, so you probably can't see this, but across the x-axis here, you're killing one to save 5, you're killing one to save, I think it's 50, 100, and is that 1,000? Is that 5,000? I can't see. You'll have to look at the experiment. What you'll notice here is this. They reckon that when you have free time, there isn't actually much change. There isn't actually much change. People are essentially giving characteristically consequentialist responses across the board. Whereas when you introduce time pressure, what they're suggesting is that you actually have to have a much bigger difference, killing one to save 1,000 in order, or at least 500, I think this is, in order to bring the two responses together. Killing one to save 5 creates a big difference. So they're saying that characteristically consequentialist responses are impaired when you limit the time. And that's exactly the prediction that we derive from our dual process theory, together with that additional assumption. So that's good. So there are two experimental findings which would seem to support the dual process theory of ethical cognition. And that's good. Now, what does it say? It says once more that there are two or more ethical processes which are distinct in the sense that the conditions which influence whether or not they occur and which outputs they generate don't completely overlap. And because we think that one of those processes will make fewer demands on scarce cognitive resources than the other, we're going to talk about a fast process, strictly speaking faster, and a slow process, strictly speaking slower. And that's all the theory says, although as you've seen, we're sometimes going to introduce additional assumptions in order to generate further testable predictions. Everything beyond this is not a core part of the theory, but requires additional evidence. Now, if you've read the paper by Green, the argument of which I'm in the process of reconstructing, and he's actually the person who I think is probably most responsible for the popularity of this dual process theory in ethics, you'll know that he uses a camera analogy in that paper, in the title of the paper and throughout the paper. I think that's a waste of time because, as he says, there are 3 ways in which the camera analogy may mislead. So Green is an absolute star, one of the heroes of this course, an absolutely brilliant person, did a PhD in metaphysics, I've heard, before he went on to become a neuroscientist. So he's absolutely ideal for the purposes of this course. But top tip here, if there's 3 ways that your analogy mislead, you really should drop it. You really should drop it. Don't give me an analogy if it's going to mislead in some way, right? Just avoid the analogy. Here's an analogy I do like though, because it's a controversial analogy. So I don't think that this is misleading, but it certainly builds in a controversial assumption. I'm drawing throughout the whole lecture today a comparison between the physical case and the ethical case. So if you looked at the preview, you saw that we can distinguish fast and slow processes in the physical case, which have different contents. The idea of the dual process theory is that we can do exactly the same in the ethical case. We can distinguish between a fast and a slow process, and we could make a guess about the kind of content that the fast and the slow processes have. And indeed, that's when Green says that the slow process responsible for ethical judgments is responsible for characteristically consequentialist judgments. He's offering a conjecture about the content of that slow process. Very good. All right. So why am I saying any of this? Well, we're in the middle of reconstructing, not really in the middle, we're at the beginning actually, of reconstructing a loose version of Green's argument for the conclusion, essentially, that philosophers are quite radically wrong about ethics for the most part. So Rawls, Cam, Foote and the rest have used entirely misguided methods. That's the conclusion. But what we're doing is just thinking about the very first premise. Ethical judgments are explained by a dual process theory, which distinguishes faster from slower processes. What I hope at this point is that we've got 2 things. First of all, that you understand the first premise, you understand what it means. And secondly, you've seen 2 bits of evidence which support it. Now, I'm not going to turn it the usual green, right? This is olive, This colour is olive. I'm not sure how it's rendering on your screen, but it should be a kind of murky green. And the reason it's a murky green is this. We've seen 2 bits of evidence that support it, so that's good. But as you know from earlier in the course, we need to do a more thorough evaluation of the evidence in order to be confident that we're really in a position to know that this is true. So for today's purposes, for the purposes of today's lecture, I think it's good enough to run with it. But if it turns out that the argument doesn't face substantial objections that are more straightforward, then we're going to have to go back and further evaluate evidence for dual process theories. The reason I don't want to do that straight away is that we could well find that later in the argument there's some other problem, and that will save us the enormous difficulty of doing such an evaluation of the evidence. Alright, so where are we? We've established the first premise of the 6-step argument, which gives us the conclusion, essentially, that philosophers are wrong to rely on premises that are not justified inferentially when they're about particular moral scenarios in constructing arguments. That's the idea. And in order to get there, the first thing we've done is to show that ethical judgments are explained by dual process theory, which distinguishes fast and slow processes.